Russia just tested its nuclear-powered Burevestnik cruise missile. Boasting almost limitless range and incalculable destructive firepower, the missile has been called invincible by Vladimir Putin and described as a flying Chernobyl by the head of the Russian army. On paper, it's one of the most powerful weapons in the world. In practice, it's a complete and utter disaster, a pointless power play with almost zero real-world value and a grim history filled with failure and chaos. This is the full story of the 9M730 Burevestnik missile, including the parts that Putin doesn't want anyone to know. It may have only just completed its first record long-distance test flight, but the Burevestnik, also known under its NATO name Skyfall, has been in development for decades. In fact, Professor Mark Galeotti, a leading Russia analyst and researcher at the Royal United Services Institute, believes that the project first started during the Soviet era, stating, "These new systems have their origin in Soviet times. They've been taken off the shelves and given new investment." In 2001, around the same time that the United States was preparing to exit the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and only 1 year into the Putin regime, Russia made the call to revive this decades-old project. Building on the foundations established in Soviet times, it started work on a new kind of missile, a nuclear-powered cruise missile capable of penetrating any interceptor-based missile defense system and traveling vast distances to strike any location anywhere in the world. On the one hand, it's easy to understand why Russia would want to develop a weapon of this kind. Conventional rocket-propelled missiles always have a limited flight time and range. They're always restricted in some way by the amount of fuel they can carry. A missile like the Burevestnik is completely different. While it's not entirely known exactly how it works or what inner mechanisms and core components it might have, it's known it's powered by its own nuclear fission reactor and most likely a ramjet engine. The way this works is quite simple in principle. As the missile flies through the sky, air is forced into the engine's inlet. That air is then heated with the aid of the nuclear reactor, which causes it to expand at incredibly high speeds and leave the engine via a nozzle at the rear, providing thrust for the missile to continue its flight. With a system like this, a nuclear-powered missile can theoretically fly much further and for far longer periods of time than any conventional counterpart. It can, in theory, launch from one location, travel thousands of miles to the other side of the Earth, take evasive aerial maneuvers to avoid enemy air defenses, and even loiter in place for several hours, if not longer, before finally striking its target. This opens up unprecedented opportunities for any military force in control of such a weapon. They would have the power to attack any enemy or piece of infrastructure anywhere in the world at any time they like. It would be an almost unparalleled deterrent, especially if equipped with a nuclear warhead. There's just one problem. The United States, the world's leading military force, already attempted to make a missile like this almost 70 years ago, and it ended up abandoning the project after seeing how chaotic and dangerous it turned out to be. During the 1950s, the US Air Force started looking into the concept of using nuclear-powered aircraft and missiles as part of its aircraft nuclear propulsion project, and the idea of using a nuclear ramjet engine was first explored in the mid-50s by two of the country's top engineers at the time, Frankie Rom and Eldon W. Sams, of the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics Lewis Research Center. Around the same time, the United States Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, was also studying the prospect of using a nuclear rocket as the upper stage of an intercontinental ballistic missile, effectively looking at ways to harness the unique capacities of nuclear power to make missiles that could go further and travel longer than any others ever invented. On January 1st, 1957, the AEC and the Air Force took the next steps. They launched Project Pluto and instructed engineers at the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory in Berkeley, California, to actually construct and test the world's first nuclear ramjet engine capable of powering a supersonic low-altitude missile, SLAM. Project Pluto proved to be a gigantic undertaking. Whole new facilities had to be built to highly precise specifications to minimize the risk when working with highly radioactive components. This included a special disassembly building named Building 2201, which had walls up to 8 feet thick in places, along with 4-foot thick lead glass viewing windows, and even a specially prepared fallout shelter nearby that the scientists could retreat to in the case of a major nuclear catastrophe. The research complex even had to have its own specially built railroad system to transport the radioactive test reactors to and from the test site. It cost $1.2 million to construct the necessary facilities, which would be closer to $12 million today, and the work had to be carried out with the utmost of precision and care, as a single error, oversight, or miscalculation could have caused a major disaster. Fortunately, the right people were picked for this project and managed to complete work on 2 experimental engines, codenamed Tory 2A, which was the world's first nuclear ramjet engine and tested in May 1961, and Tory 2C, which was significantly larger and tested in May 1964. Both engines worked, so the tests were successful to a certain extent. However, on July 1, 1964, 7.5 years after Project Pluto began, it was officially cancelled. There were 3 main reasons for this. First, intercontinental ballistic missile (ICBM) technology developed much faster than many military experts had anticipated. This effectively reduced the need for nuclear-powered cruise missiles, since ICBMs had many of the same advantages. They could travel incredible distances to strike targets all over the globe and were also able to move at remarkable speeds, several times faster than the speed of sound, to help them evade enemy air defenses. In fact, compared to conceptual nuclear-powered cruise missiles, ICBMs are faster and less vulnerable to interception by enemy air defenses. Second, there were blatant environmental and public safety concerns regarding the testing, storage, transport, and usage of nuclear-powered missiles. While working on Project Pluto, scientists found that the unshielded design of the nuclear reactors led to lethal fission byproducts like cesium-137 and iodine-131 being ejected into the atmosphere via the engine's exhaust plumes. In other words, a missile like this had the potential to contaminate everything along its flight path, poisoning ecosystems and spreading radioactive pollution far and wide. This made testing it almost impossible, as officials weren't able to identify any reasonable, safe or suitable location to use. Third, and perhaps most important, there were simply too many risks and unpredictable variables involved in working with nuclear-powered engines and other components. The risk of the missile crashing and causing a major disaster was too high, and the engineering challenges involved with making and maintaining air-breathing nuclear engines were enormous. Costs spiraled, and despite their successes, the development team faced countless issues along the way, including material corrosion caused by neutron flux and malfunctioning electronic systems. Weighing up the increasingly small pros and relatively huge cons, the US Department of Defense made the obvious decision to scrap the project, shifting its focus to much more reliable, stable, and affordable ICBM technologies. The US is the most powerful military in the world and has been for generations. It doesn't make decisions lightly, and it wouldn't have given up on a plan like Project Pluto without strong, solid reasons. Thus, Russia could and should have learned an obvious lesson from this story. It should have understood that nuclear-powered missiles were neither feasible nor sustainable, and it could have saved itself a huge amount of time, money, and hassle by following America's example and moving on to other areas of development. Instead, Putin made the call to revive the project, unknowingly setting into motion a series of devastating events that would see several people killed. Since work on the Burevestnik recommenced, the missile has undergone several failed test flights. In November 2017, for example, a missile was launched from the Pankovo test range on Yuzhny Island in the Arctic Ocean. It flew for a measly 2 minutes, covering around 21 miles before crashing into the Barents Sea between Norway and Russia. There were numerous other reports of failed flights too, with around half a dozen Burevestnik missiles said to have veered widely out of control and off course after their propulsion systems faltered and nuclear reactors destabilized, with several ending up in the depths of the White Sea just off the northwest coast of Russia. Every time this happened, radiation was released into the surrounding environment, with numerous harmful elements including tritium and cesium seeping out into the air, ice and water, poisoning local wildlife and polluting ecosystems for years to come. As usual, the Kremlin has done its best to cover up these catastrophes, and in March 2018, seemingly undeterred by the missile's many failures up to that point, President Putin took to the stage for his annual State of the Nation address, officially unveiling the Burevestnik to the Russian public and the wider world. Introducing the missile's capabilities, Putin said, "We started to develop new types of strategic arms that do not use ballistic trajectories at all when moving toward a target, and therefore missile defense systems are useless against them, absolutely pointless. One of them is a small-scale heavy-duty nuclear energy unit that can be installed in a missile like our latest X-101 air-launched missile or the American Tomahawk missile. A similar type, but with a range dozens of times longer. Dozens, basically an unlimited range. The Russian president went on to show an animation of the missile in action, going on to claim that the missile had already been successfully tested. It is a low-flying stealth missile carrying a nuclear warhead with almost an unlimited range, unpredictable trajectory, and ability to bypass interception boundaries. It's invincible against all existing and prospective missile defense and counter-air defense systems. I will repeat this several times today. During its flight, the nuclear-powered engine reached its design capacity and provided the necessary propulsion. Now that the missile launch and ground tests were successful, we can begin developing a completely new type of weapon, a strategic nuclear weapon system with a nuclear-powered missile. Putin has long been a master of propaganda, and his speech painted a picture of a groundbreaking, game-changing weapon. In reality, the Burevestnik was still quite literally struggling to get off the ground at the time he gave this speech, and 1 year later, things were about to get much worse. On August 8, 2019, the Burevestnik program encountered its biggest and costliest disaster at the State Central Navy testing range near Neonoxa on the White Sea. There, specialist ships had been deployed to recover one of the many missiles that had crash-landed into the water. While attempting to lift the submerged prototype from the sea floor, a liquid fuel booster linked with the missile's nuclear core detonated when it came into contact with the atmosphere. The resulting blast killed 5 technicians in the blink of an eye. Additional reports suggest that 2 or 3 more personnel later died from radiation-related complications, bringing the total number of fatalities to roughly 7. Those affected were said to have suffered symptoms consistent with acute radiation exposure, including dermal necrosis, gastrointestinal hemorrhages, and multiple organ failure. Other personnel at the site of the incident were exposed to exceptionally high and dangerous doses of ionizing radiation, going on to suffer severe sickness, burns, nausea, and other effects. On top of that, many of the emergency workers, including first responders and paramedics who were dispatched to the scene, were not given proper warnings or informed about the nature of the accident. As a result, they too were exposed to nuclear radiation, with several reporting elevated white blood cell counts and potential long-term health risks that have not been publicly documented. Fallout from the explosion led to several dangerous elements spreading across the surrounding environment, including strontium-91, barium-140, and lanthanum-140 isotopes. Gamma radiation levels spiked in towns and cities miles away, like Severodvinsk, which was around 19 miles from the blast. It was a complete catastrophe, with innocent lives lost, countless people put at risk, and ecosystems poisoned for years to come. After an event like that, many military generals and world leaders would have made the right decision. They would have called off the program there and then, coming to the logical and clear conclusion that it was simply too dangerous to persist with. But not Putin. The Russian leader has always displayed a callous regard for human life. He cares little about the deaths of ordinary Russian citizens or the destruction of the natural world. As long as he maintains or expands his grasp of power, it doesn't matter how many lives are lost or what price the population has to pay. So, unsurprisingly, he made the call to push on with the project. Even when meeting with widows of those who had lost their lives, he reportedly said, "We will certainly be perfecting this weapon regardless of anything." In other words, he didn't care how many people died in the White Sea disaster, or how many more might perish in subsequent failures. He wanted his missile, and he'd stop at nothing to get it. So, development continued, leading all the way up to the present day and the very recent long-range test flight of the Burevestnik missile. On October 26, alongside the head of his army, General Valery Gerasimov, Putin confirmed that the missile had completed a 14,000 kilometers, 8,700-mile Arctic flight. I clearly remember that when we announced the development of this weapon, even very high-level, top-class specialists told me the goal was worthy and respectable, but unattainable in the near historical perspective. Once again, that was the view of those high-class experts, and now the decisive tests have been completed. Obviously, substantial work has to be done in order to place this weapon on combat duty, and all regulations must be completed. Nevertheless, as I understand it, the key objectives have been achieved. Putin went on to boast that this is a unique product that no one in the world has, before announcing, "We will need to determine which class of weapons this new system belongs to, identify possible modes of employment, and begin preparing the infrastructure to base it in our armed forces." General Gerasimov, meanwhile, somewhat bizarrely compared the missile to a tiny flying Chernobyl, referencing the famous nuclear power plant that's best known for the 1986 disaster in which one of its reactors exploded. Nuclear and military experts around the world have responded to the news with a mixture of shock, outrage, and disdain. Jeffrey Lewis, a nuclear non-proliferation expert at Middlebury College, stated, "This is a bad development. It's one more science fiction weapon that's going to be destabilizing and hard to address in arms control." Writing in the Kyiv Post, Chuck Farah, a former squadron leader with the US Navy SEAL Team 6, shared his view. In reality, the Burevestnik represents a Frankensteinian folly, a revival of a doomsday concept the United States abandoned decades ago as dangerous and unworkable. In a desperate bid to project power amid mounting battlefield defeats and economic isolation, Russia has grown perilously irresponsible, resurrecting this Frankenstein's monster at the cost of lives and legacies. Farah went on to note that according to experts, the unshielded design of a missile like this is utterly unworkable. It will never be made entirely reliable or safe, and if Russia continues to test it, widespread radiological contamination will inevitably ensue. The Burevestnik is not a strategic asset but a useless, dangerous and deadly stunt. Its very flight path a toxic scar on the fragile Arctic environment where melting ice amplifies radionuclide spread to global currents. But perhaps the biggest, boldest and most damning reaction of all came from the US President Donald Trump. Speaking aboard Air Force One, Trump was asked about Russia's recent test of the Burevestnik and replied in no uncertain terms,
"They know we have a nuclear submarine, the greatest in the world, right off their shore. So, it doesn't have to go 8,000 miles. And they're not playing games with us. We're not playing games with them either. We test missiles all the time." I don't think it's an appropriate thing for Putin to be saying either, by the way. You ought to get the war ended. A war that should have taken 1 week is now in its soon 4th year. That's what you ought to do instead of testing missiles.
Trump's view is clear. If Putin plans to play mind games or intimidate the Western world with this new weapon, he's going to be sorely disappointed. As the US president notes, America has plenty firepower of its own, with a vast nuclear arsenal, world-leading missile technologies, and nuclear-powered submarines stationed in strategic locations around the world. It has no reason to fear Putin's new missile, especially given the weapon's disastrous track record so far. And with Russian forces continuing to flounder in Ukraine, the Kremlin is quite frankly humiliating itself by boasting about brand new missile technologies when it can barely capture and hold cities in a war against a much smaller opponent. All in all, this simply feels like another example of Putin's hubris getting the best of him. And while the Russian leader may think he's projecting power by dressing up in combat fatigues and boasting about the range of his fancy new missile, he has in fact never looked weaker or more vulnerable than this. Now, learn more about Putin's desperation in this video, which looks at how Russia recently staged a fake victory in Ukraine in order to convince the world it's winning the war. Or check out this video to see how even Ukrainian farmers are finding ways to outsmart Russian forces, proving that the Kremlin's war machine is a much weaker and tamer beast than anyone could have imagined. And finally, make sure to subscribe to our channel too, to be among the first to find out about the latest breaking news and big developments from the Russia-Ukraine war.